Turmoil or Reform, South Africa's Political Economy After 2014. And this Pitso will unpack the book edited by Prof Parsons. That's really, perfect timing because we're going into elections and we need to reflect on where we're at as a country and what are some of the things that we need to do to move forward. For our panel today, the discussion is moderated by Kaya Setole, and I think at this point we can call Kaya a friend of the NW Business School. He's been involved in a number of our Pitsos. He is a chartered accountant, an activist and academic. He writes on matters of politics, economics and finance and social justice. And many of us follow him online, and you can follow him online and on the media to hear his views on matters. For our discussions, we have Prof Raymond Parsons. He's a member of the NW Business School, and Prof Parsons has a long, illustrious career in both the public and private sector. Some key highlights include serving as the Director General of the South African Chamber of Business, a convener for NETLAC, and a governmental representative to the South African Reserve Bank. And he also led the Economic Society of South Africa. Many would be familiar with Prof Parsons as he gives contributions on public and general economic matters, and he's also responsible for our Policy Uncertainty Index. Isaiah Mhlanga is the Chief Economist and the Head of Research for Rand Bank, a Fellow of Economic Research Southern Africa. He writes for the media, for the Business Day and the Sunday Times, and was the APSIP Economist of the Year. With them, we have a member of the NW Business School, Prof Jan van Rombeck. He's an Associate Professor of the Business School. And this year marks 20 years at the university, and a journey that includes a number of roles. Prof Jan has got a background in forensic accounting, and he is also involved in a number of forensic studies, assisting as an expert witness in civil disputes. So up to you, Kaya, to facilitate the discussions, and thank you very much for joining this meeting.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and good afternoon to everyone. And I think obviously we are about 55 days away from the general election, and I think what has obviously been quite interesting is to observe the type of conversations that people are having ahead of what is rumored to be a hotly contested election. What we have today is the privilege to engage with a panel of panelists who have been participating in one of the more important outputs that we've seen in recent weeks, and that's obviously the book that has been put together that is referred to as The Tipping Point, which you all must go and buy. I've already got my copy. So it says Turmoil or Reform, South Africa's Political Economy After 2024. And of course, the very first question that one must address is a simple question of why we have such a book and what it seeks to address. And on that note, Professor Raymond Parsons, I'd like to bring you in here. You have obviously been responsible for convening this very important archive, but tell us exactly what it is that, publications of this nature seek to achieve, particularly ahead of a general election cycle.
Yes, well, good afternoon to everyone. And you asked me, Kaya, to outline, as you've indicated, why the book was written and what it is all about, since everyone would not yet have a copy. About a year ago, I sat down with the publisher and we looked into the crystal ball of a year hence and asked ourselves, well, what should we now be preparing ourselves for? And we thought already then that we will be looking at a game changer in this election, that there would in fact be much more political competition to assess and to evaluate, and that with it would come a degree of uncertainty because it would be a completely new situation, not only around the election, but what would lie beyond the election. In other words, what sort of national agenda could we visualize as authors in the book? And we also decided it would be a collaborative effort, not a solo performance, because we wanted a cross-section of expertise, of thought leaders who would contribute on the converging future that we would like to see. So it's a collaborative effort of 14 chapters. And one of the surprising aspects, because at the time we thought, well, we won't be the only book. There'll be several books coming out now, just before the election, to probe the dynamics of the election and what might lie beyond. But as far as we can ascertain, although there have been a number of very interesting op-ed articles, there have been a lot of television debates, surveys, this appears at the moment to be the only in-depth book that has been written prior to the election that, as it were, puts the dipstick into where we are with the election, what are the dynamics around the election, and what might lie beyond it. So as some of, indeed most of those who are participating in this webinar would not have seen the book, I need to just give you some ideas to what is covered, what is the range, the spectrum of the issues that are addressed in the book. And I left it open, of course, to the various contributors. It was their decision how they would want to write about their particular aspect. And they would be free to assess both the successes and the failures of the past 30 years of democracy, of the 3 decades of democracy. All I asked them was that in applying their minds to it, they should be intellectually rigorous. They must write in accessible language and avoid jargon, and they must be solution orientated. Once they've finished wringing their hands about what has gone wrong, they must be able to tell us what we need to do to put it right. And I must say, I think they've all stepped up to the plate, and they've addressed both the political, the economic, the business, and the social implications of where we stand. Let me just briefly go through the contents so that you have some idea of the spectrum. The first is unpacking the political party dynamics in a post-apartheid South Africa. That's Anthony Butler. Then there's coalition politics. Is this the way? Ralph Makgetla. Then there's the chapter on the economy, business and reform, and that is Cass Curadio. Then there's power struggles, shedding light on South Africa's enduring energy challenges, Rod Crompton and Bruce Young. Do geopolitics and trade clash? South Africa's foreign and trade policy options, Antoni van Niekerk. Is Africa open for business? Daniel Minameli. South Africa's financial future, keeping the debt trap at bay. That's Isa Mashlanga, who is with us. Banking on credibility, the central bank and monetary policy after 2024, and that is Hilary Joffe. Then the next chapter is broadening farm ownership for successful transformation in South African agriculture. In other words, all about property rights and property wrongs. That's Johan Kirsten and Wandile Shaloba. Can we conquer corruption in South Africa? We've got Jan van Romberg with us to speak on that today. Then there's a chapter on local government in South Africa after the 2024 election. Will the desirable or the probable outcomes prevail? Then the 12th chapter is finding new bottom-up solutions to grassroots by Vuoswela Ramaphosa, and she emphasizes the extent to which we mustn't only look for top-down solutions, but also promote the bottom-up solutions. Then there's a chapter by Judge Dennis Davis, strengthening the institutions of public accountability in South Africa. And then finally, I have a chapter pulling together all the threads, South Africa grappling in an age of uncertainty, looking both at the issue of policy uncertainty and political uncertainty that might arise around this particular election and its aftermath. So those are the main highlights of what is in the book. Now, while each chapter, Kaya, must speak for itself, I'm not going to speak for them, but I can tell you what are some of the common themes that appear to have emerged. What are some of the common factors that appear to have emerged from the 14 chapters? Well, the first is, I think there's agreement that the 2024 elections are the most important ones that we've seen in South Africa since 1994, and that there is no doubt a distinct breaking of the mold to a greater or lesser extent of the political mold that we have seen in South Africa over the past 30 years. Then secondly, there seems to be a consensus that an accumulation of the socioeconomic challenges that South Africa has not yet resolved sufficiently have brought us to a tipping point where we are at a T-junction, where we must either decide that we are going to reform and change the situation, or we're going to perpetuate some of the difficulties that we are facing at the moment. The third point that seems to emerge from the various chapters is that indeed many of the solutions lie hidden in plain sight, and they are in the chapters in many instances. They require the political will and the capacity, often in conjunction with the private sector. That's quite an important point that has come through, that needs to be done in order to implement and create a bigger, stronger, and better economy after the election. The next point is that the issue which is dealt with in some detail, and which I know is the topical issue of the day, the prospects of a coalition government, not only at the national level, but also at the provincial level. The prospect, the possibility, as some of the pundits tell us, that in at least 3 provinces you could also have a coalition government. I remind you that in those 3 provinces, Gauteng, KZN, and possibly the Western Cape, add up to 63% of our gross domestic product. So it's quite important what the outcomes might be there, what the economic and the business implications might be. So the issue here is simply that if we have the emergence of a larger degree of coalition government, we will want to see that there will be good politics that will guarantee the good economics that we need after the election. The next point that seems to come through is that it's clear from both the chapters and from what we know so far of the public debate that there's simply a wide range of outcomes being offered by in particular the political pundits. Every week there's another survey or someone, so you can take your pick when you talk about the majority that the governing ANC may get. You can take your pick: 51, 48, 45, 41, 39. These are all options on the table, and all have different implications, obviously, both political and to some extent economic. I think also, Kaya, I might mention that there's a recognition in all the chapters that effective reform, as urgently as we push it, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. But the fact remains that there's a sense of urgency that comes through in all the chapters, and saying that we really need to be very conscious of the fact that the reforms that need to be implemented are urgent. They will not all happen overnight, but we need to give hope that they're underway and they are beginning, that we can speed up the pace of what we are committed to, and also assure business and the country that those issues that have not yet been addressed will be expedited on the reform front. And so finally, if I could just quote one paragraph, overarching paragraph, which I think emerges from the various chapters, but which I've put into my own words, which I think resonates with what most of the authors and my collaborators, whom I thank for all their contributions, have put into the book. Let me quote: "While the virtues of democracy in general, and South Africa's constitution in particular, are often rightly lauded, a successful democracy is one that delivers the economic benefits that many citizens have come to expect. A bigger, stronger, and better economy is an indispensable bulwark of democracy in South Africa. In the final analysis, shared and inclusive economic prosperity remains the only secure guarantee of a democratic order in this country." So what these chapters have sought to do around this watershed election is to say, these are the issues that will give us that vision that we want, not only in the way we deal with this election, but also what may emerge after it, good governance and a prosperous economy shared by all. And really the purpose of all these chapters is to inform and to enlighten those who are interested on the thoughts that the various contributors have made, so that we can emerge from this watershed election with much better outcomes than we've been able to secure so far. So that, I think, is just a broad sketch of why the book was written, why we think its timing is important, and why we think it could be helpful, not only for the average voter who wants to know more about some of the issues, but also to those who have to show the leadership and the decision-making, not only during the election, but more particularly after the election.
Thank you very much, Raymond. I think you probably have captured the alchemy of all the chapters much more succinctly than anyone else could have done so. But I think obviously that is reflective of your engagement and your intimacy with the process itself. Now, obviously, as I read through the book, I was going through the different chapters and trying to understand the different, articulations of what the problem statement is. And I think obviously core to this is the fact that in spite of everything that South Africa has committed itself to doing, there always seems to be bottlenecks in execution, and those bottlenecks come with consequences. Isa, you've written a chapter that talks about the debt trap, that we need to keep at bay. And the moment I saw the chapter's heading, I was like, well, actually, this is maybe a preemptive strike that says that we should avoid this. And then I looked at the data in your own chapter, and then I said, wait, hold on, it looks like a ship has sailed. The amount that we're spending on debt, the commitments that we have, even before accounting for the contingent liabilities, you give me the impression that the debt trap is already where we find ourselves stuck. But in your chapter, you obviously firstly speak about the idea of imprudent fiscal policy choices. You list some of them. And I was reading through them, I was saying, wait, hold on. I see that these are indeed unsound policy choices. But if I'm looking ahead of it at this particular election, I do not know whether whoever emerges in government after that day is actually going to do anything to reverse those and undo some of them, because they seem to be tapping into what one might call the pulse of South African society. You talk about SOE bailouts, people hold these institutions very dearly to them. You talk about free higher education, I would not be the person that comes up and says, actually, we need to do something about that. You have some recommendations about how to fund the SRD COVID-19 grant. Again, some of these are going to come with very difficult trade-offs and consequences. Talk us through how you synthesize your chapter and what you want us to take from it going forward.
Thanks, Kaya. I think you summarized succinctly the main points. I think we always have this debate that does South Africa have a debt problem? Does South Africa has a growth problem? We don't disagree on the growth problem. It's there. Growth has been below 2% for a very long time. It hasn't grown above that for any substantial time after the global financial crisis. But where the disagreements lie is whether we have a debt problem or not. And if we are to look at South Africa's debt relative to other peer emerging economies, it's quite clear that our debt trajectory is out of sync with our peers, but also it shows up in our debt servicing cost, which now takes about 21 cents in every range of revenue. But also if you then look at our debt costs relative to other peers, we also see that our interest costs are actually outside of the interquartile range of the emerging market peers, which means it's increasingly crowding out other spending. So let me perhaps just mention quickly the 4 problems that our debt brings about into our economy. The first one is the rising interest payments crowd out other capital spending at a national level, at a SOE level. You can see pretty much from 2014 and beyond, as interest payments rise, the way that Treasury has consolidated was through capital spending, which then shows up in our dilapidated infrastructure, whether it's roads, it's rail, it's ports. All of these things have their genesis in the consolidation that was done in capital spending rather than in current spending. And then you look at the second problem, which is the increased bank holdings of South African government bonds, which then implies less capital available from the banks to lend in other productive sectors of the economy because they are increasingly holding government bonds. That in itself is also a problem that we are seeing, which is crowding out productive capital. The third one is a steeper yield curve. It's not only steep, but it has shifted upwards, which means the cost of capital across the whole economy has increased. This is markets telling you that our debt is now potentially unsustainable. And as a result, to hold this debt, they require a higher yield than before. And the fourth one is the general deterioration in creditworthiness that has culminated in us losing investment grade and ultimately showing up in a weaker exchange rate. In itself, also inflationary, but it increases the cost of capital goods across the economy. So we need to settle this debate on whether we have a debt problem or not. We do have a debt problem in addition to a growth problem. Then the question is, how then do we solve it? One, you need to increase your growth so your tax revenue can be able to fund the interest costs. If you can't do that, you are left with reducing the debt servicing cost, which is what you tend to see in the recent budget. As far as the tapping of GFECRA is concerned, it has been exclusively earmarked to reduce our quantum of debt and as a result, our debt servicing costs, because it's quite obvious the growth boosting reforms are going to take too long while we require the need to reduce the debt servicing cost and immediately. And if you also look at what Treasury has been doing over the years, they've been changing somewhat the funding strategy, funding on the short end of the yield curve because long end is expensive, using a lot more DFI funding than traditional funding in the capital market. So World Bank, IMF, New Development Bank, and others, which is slightly different to what we had known over the years, where there was a view that says we don't borrow from the likes of the IMF or the World Bank as much as we should because we want policy autonomy. That seems to have changed post-COVID. It's a recognition of the difficulty to borrow from the market and how expensive it is. So we have already seen that. So there is that pressure, which we think has been acknowledged, which we also think if we are not careful and if we don't take the hard choices in terms of the reforms that are required, we will find ourselves in a debt crisis over the next couple of years or so.
Now, thanks for that, Isaac. I mean, one of the problems, obviously, that emerges from the chapter is the reality that there isn't enough revenue that is being generated in order to fund the very ambitious spending program of government. And obviously, that's what explains the gravitation towards the debt. So the question that I had for you is that, is it inevitable that a government that actually doesn't know or doesn't have the capacity to grow its economy or to grow the revenue, is it then inevitable that that government would gravitate towards borrowing its way through sustainability? And when I say that, the bigger question is that, well, would a new government after the 29th of May have the capacity to do anything differently? Because if there's no revenue, well, the only answer is that you must do either the debt solution or you must cut the spending, as you say in your chapter. But cutting the spending, when so many people have become reliant on the state, you are basically saying to whoever gets elected that the moment they get into power, they must work towards getting themselves out of power, aren't you?
In fact, Kaya, we don't have a revenue problem, even though we have very low growth that we have seen over the many years since global financial crisis. If you look at tax to revenue, tax to GDP ratio is at an all-time high since the 1960s, which means our problem is not revenue per se. Our problem is spending. We have an inability to control spending, but even when we spend, we also have an inability to improve the quality of that spending, which means for every 1 rand that we spend, we don't actually get the boost that we should get from the economy. And if you look in the budget, there is a chapter that talks about spending multipliers or fiscal multipliers, and it clearly shows that over the years, we have seen a decline in fiscal multipliers such that for every 1 rand we spend, we ended up getting negative growth. That is by 2019. It recovered slightly in COVID years, and we are now back to the same trend that we saw during the period 2009 to 2019, where those multipliers are declining again. which means we don't get a boost in economic growth by increasing government spending, precisely because there are a lot of leakages, but also because of the quality of spending. So we need to move away from this view that says if we increase government spending, we will actually see a boost in economic growth until we do the reforms that make sure that there are no leakages, but also the quality of that spending does not end up in increased imports, which essentially exports jobs from the economy, but it boosts the productivity of the South African economy in a way that can then boost economic growth overall.
Thanks, Isaac. Johan, you've written a chapter which had a rather brave title, if I may call it that, and it says, "Can we conquer corruption in South Africa?" I can tell you what my answer was before I started reading your chapter. But just borrowing from what Isaac had said in the question of the leakages that we have in the system, I imagine when one looks at the overall picture of what happens with our spending problems, we do have technical leakages in the sense that I'm simply not as competent as I need to be in order to do the job that I've been deployed to do. And there's also obviously the criminal leakages that simply say, well, I'm in here, I've got the capacity to extract from this tender or from this contract, so therefore I'm going to do so. So I imagine that the consequential effects of those two dimensions is what contributes to what Isaac was talking about us simply not getting the benefit associated with the quantum of what we put in there. You've written a chapter that says, we can conquer corruption in South Africa. How can that possibly be achieved when so many of the things that have led us here seem to be so intractable, seem to be so permanent in nature? What are you seeing that I don't see?
Yeah, it's a difficult question and it's not a single answer, but perhaps to link on to what Isaac said in terms of spending and the spending problem. Obviously, the quality of your spending depends also on the leakages, and we can call it corruption for a lack of that. Now, we from the academic side still have difficulty to say how endemic is corruption and how do you measure it. You have these indexes of people's perception, but normally, corruption is a happy crime. Everybody is supposed to walk away happy from the scene, and it's not detected. So we don't know how prevalent it is. So before I answer your question, if you look at the fraud examiners and their statistics, they talk roughly, say, about 5% of an enterprise revenue get lost as a result of fraud and corruption. South Africa is definitely not at the 5% level. It must be much higher. So if you look at government spending of 2 trillion and you take a multiplier of 10% and you sit with a figure of 200 billion or whatever, it then becomes very significant when you compare those figures to the statistics we read in the news that says, well, 1 billion here and 2 million there. It is so insignificant in the bigger scheme of spending if we start looking at the numbers. So I just wanted to say that as an intro. But you're asking me, Jan, how can you say, can we conquer corruption? And I say, yes, Kaya, I think all hope is not lost. I think the last 2-3 years have given very, very good signs. One of those good signs, I think, was the Zondo Commission. A lot of people said, well, where are the prosecutions and why are the people not in jail? But I think if you look at the level of awareness created through, for instance, the Zondo Commission, the openness of information, the way that the media contributed, our free media, to exposing certain facts and elements was very, very positive. I think the type of marketing, for lack of a better word, amongst our population was terrific. So if you ask me, Jan, can we conquer corruption? I've got two main things I want to refer to. The one thing is South Africa has got a beautiful skill set. It's lying all over. It's lying in private sector. There are good skills in public sector as well. It should gel together, and there are many ways how private-public partnerships can work together. I think it's time that the joint cause of the fight against corruption get that thing right, where we have public-private partnerships. The second thing that is very prevalent and as a preventative measure is the quality of people that are appointed. In other words, before any organization, public or private, appoint a person, homework must be done to make sure who you appoint, what is the position of this person. And then we get stuck in these very simple narratives of, as soon as you do a conflict declaration, you're fine. What about a conflict declaration? Are you doing business with your conflicts? Is that monitored? How's your balance sheet when you start out in a financial position in public sector, and how does it look midway or at the end of the term? How did you accumulate wealth? And if I say you and all your related entities. So, you know, it's a topic that I can go on for hours and hours, but I'm positive. Yeah. I think if we have the public-private partnerships, and then also the use of our auditors, our Auditor General, and the skill sets that are available. To link onto you, Isa, funding. I mean, if we start paying more debt costs, there's less left for essential expenditure needed in an NPA, in an SIU, in an AG, in a financial intelligence center, etc., etc.
Yeah, and just one last part of it. In your chapter, you speak about information sharing, and I think probably that's the one that appealed to me a lot because you can imagine there are so many state institutions that all see particular elements of what I do. And in the absence of that coordination, it feels like the sum of those particular instruments can do a lifestyle audit as I go. But it seems that there isn't enough overlaps and, coordination that makes it happen. So therefore, we now end up with everybody looking at their neighbor saying, well, I wonder how he affords it, but no one seems to be holding them accountable. And when we heard this week that according to SARS, they've done lifestyle audits on people using fancy cars as a basis and they've recovered millions in taxes, it suddenly feels like if belatedly somebody's woken up and said, well, actually, this is the way things can be done. Why is it taking us so long? And if it's taken us so long, over 30 years, is there any hope that it will be resolved anytime soon?
Yeah, it is. It has taken long. The irony is the information is available. It's not that difficult information, but it must be linked and it must be shared. The problem obviously is if you get investigators that sit in private sector and they start using personal information or sensitive information for wrong purposes, you can imagine how haywire that goes. But if soon as you get a fusion and a working together of information and a properly protected environment, that's where the answer lies. I don't want to mention the word scorpions, but a similar like special dedicated type commission where you have your investigators, financial, your legal guys, all grouping together with the sharing of information. That's where the magic lies. If you can't have basic type investigations for specialized type criminality that happen, you need clever guys to catch the clever crooks. And you need to fuse that information and work together. So SARS has got a lot of power. Just a side note on SARS, I think SARS is doing very well. Imagine if they were not doing the job as good as they would, how worse the country would look like. But the information sharing aspect, Kaya, is extremely crucial. But sometimes it feels to me like that things like a POPI Act and stuff like that, it feels like that we protect more criminals than the man on the street. And there needs to be a point where you say, well, what is the bigger priority? My personal information or the fight against corruption? So you need the laws of the country. You can't have any cowboy out there walking around with people's information, but the skills and the laws under the auspices of public sector, that's what needs to happen.
No, thank you very much for that. Raymond, I want to come back to you now. So when one reads this book, you said that you wanted it to be solutions orientated. And when people read through the chapters, they may get the impression that, look, at the end of the day, everybody says, actually, no, we can get this right. We can do this right. And I think, obviously, the existence of the bottlenecks is something that we cannot deny. The existence of the leakages and the divergences in what should be working together is something that we cannot deny. So what exactly is it that we need to fix first in order for some of the solutions that actually emerge in this book to actually have to stand a chance of getting us there as a country?
Well, I think what we're seeing and what we're listening here today, and if we look at what is in the book, it's really saying to us, look, we are at a critical point where we must not have too much talk chasing too little action, because I think that's been a very important part of the past, that indeed it's been procrastination has been the enemy of delivery, effective delivery, not taking decisions quickly enough, not building the capacity and not ensuring that we implement what we say. In the book, I've been around long enough to list over 30 years all the excellent economic plans we've had. The Reconstruction and Development Plan, GEAR, as GESA, there was a Growth and Development Summit, job summits. We're not seeing outcomes that justify the amount of effort that goes in. And then we end up with, as ISA said, with a poor growth performance. It's not job-rich growth. So why, given all these well-intentioned plans, are we having the debate we're having today? But one of the important issues which has come through recently, and I think is a sign of hope, is this high-level cooperation between senior business executives and the government, focusing on 3 priority areas, which they identified. They said, we're not going to cover the whole waterfront. We're going to deal with energy. We're going to apply our minds to that. We're going to apply our minds to the logistics and transport, and to crime and corruption. And although it's been a slow process, there was a report recently from Business Unity South Africa, which has been very much involved as a driver of this process, that there are some results coming. Now, the important point is, yes, this is a watershed election. Yes, there are a lot of uncertainties around it, but there are some things we must get on with irrespective of the election, because almost all the parties would probably agree that those 3 priorities are important. And to the extent that better cooperation, coming back to the point that Jan has made, better and more effective cooperation between the government and the private sector, this is tremendously important, and it mustn't. And what's more, when there is cooperation, or when there needs to be consultation in advance with interested parties, that consultation must not be reasonable, see it my way. Consultation must be effective, and it must be seen to make a difference to the outcomes. Too many decisions are taken which then become a shock to the market, shock to business, shock to stakeholders, because the ground has not been well prepared. There hasn't been effective consultation, or such consultation as has taken place is purely nominal. You go through the motions, but you still end up doing what you said you were going to do originally. You can't run a country like that. And the fact is that hopefully after this election, and depending, of course, on the coalition dynamics, how effective they are, we know that the track record there is not very good at the local and the metro level. But the point made in the book is other countries are able to run a coalition government effectively, and we must learn from the mistakes we've made, because it's no good going from the frying pan into the fire in regard to a coalition setup that is not effective, doesn't give you stable and effective government, doesn't give you the delivery that you want. So I think the important point here is, the important point that comes through is that we must build on the cooperation between government and the private sector in a way that cuts a lot deeper in the areas that are important, and then we must see whether we can build on that. I come back to my point. If we want good economics after this election, we will need good politics, and that requires leadership and political will, but based on the ability to cooperate with stakeholders, in particularly the private sector, because investment, the whole issue of investment growth, that's a large source of our growth, is to get investment, to get investor confidence up. That's tremendously important. And if we want to grow at 3 and 4%, we cannot be satisfied with the fact that our total investment, that is government and the private sector, is at the moment 15% of GDP. Now, that might sound wonderful, except the National Development Plan has made it very clear, and so have others, that we need 30% of GDP. So we're only halfway there, and that's why we're only growing at 1%. And that's why we have all sorts of unemployment and fiscal and other problems. So eventually, as to oversimplify, but all roads eventually lead against good governance and higher growth. And we need the political outcomes that will give us that after the election.
All right. Now, if you read the book, if you buy the book, as you all should, it's already available. There's also a link there on the chat. You will discover that One of the more interesting chapters is actually the one that talks about this idea of coalition governments. And I think for me, when I first started reading it, I was anxious to think, well, for 30 years, we've had one party that had the capacity to write and implement policies without having to really get the concurrence of other parties, and they still haven't got us there. Now, imagine what happens when the concurrence of so many other discrete and divergent parties is going through the way things need to be done. I'm very anxious about what that looks like. But of course, in the book, you get much more granular insights into what the permutations and the possibilities are. So I definitely recommend that you do buy the book. There is also going to be an official launch next week on the 10th of April here in Sandton. And those of you that may have an interest in attending that, please do get in contact with the NW team, and they may give you, ideas on whether there's still capacity in that particular meeting. So of course, this has been the Pitso conversation focusing on Tipping Point, which is for me one of the more important books that we've seen heading up to this particular general election. It gives the type of insights that are important for us to reflect on what the permutations and the possibilities might be, so that it informs our decision making ahead of the 29 May ballot. Thank you very much for having joined us, and have a wonderful afternoon further.